The chamber was never truly quiet. Even when no one spoke, it breathed. It hummed with the soft sounds of translation devices, the shifting of alien bodies in seats built for dozens of different shapes, and the low electronic pulse of the lighting grid that kept the massive hall visible to eyes of every kind. The Grand Conclave Chamber of the Interstellar Covenant was one of the largest rooms ever built by living hands. It sat at the center of a space station that had taken 40 years and 11 species to construct, orbiting the slow, golden mass of Verath Prime. 61 civilizations had a seat in that room. 61 flags hung from the curved ceiling. 61 voices could speak there, in theory. On this day, only one voice mattered. The Dreth High Speaker stood at the main podium. He was tall by most standards, with dark gray skin that looked almost metallic under the chamber lights, 4 thick arms folded across a broad chest, and eyes that were completely black from edge to edge. He wore the ceremonial armor of the Dreth Dominion, deep red plates trimmed with the gold markings that recorded every world they had ever conquered. There were many markings. He looked out at the assembled delegates with the easy calm of someone who had never once been told no. His name was Vokrath. He had given speeches like this before, 14 times to be exact. He tapped the podium once, and the room fell into the kind of silence that only happened when everyone was afraid. "The Dreth Dominion," he said, his voice moving through the translators in a smooth, flat wave, "hereby formally announces its intent to bring the planet Earth and its surrounding system under Dominion authority. The process will begin in 90 standard cycles. We have reviewed the planet's defenses. We have reviewed its military capacity. We have reviewed its population and its resources." He paused, not for effect, just because he could. The outcome is not in question. He stepped back from the podium. That was it. No demands, no negotiation offer, no warning to evacuate. The Dreth never gave warnings. Warnings implied that the other side had options. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then slowly, the noise came back, not the normal background hum, but something lower and more nervous. Delegates leaned toward each other. Translation devices flickered with urgent whispers. On the far left side of the chamber, the Murath Empire's representative was already looking at his personal screen, probably sending messages back home. On the upper tier, the Kreth Collective's 3-bodied delegates sat perfectly still, which meant they were thinking very hard. Ambassador Velthara of the Usan sat in the middle section, in a seat designed for a body with 6 limbs and a wide base. She was old, by Usan standards. Old enough to remember the last time the Dreth had made an announcement like this, about a world called Vel Sora IV. She remembered the footage that came after. She did not like remembering it. She turned her cluster of amber eyes slowly toward the section reserved for the human delegation. It was empty. The chair, the nameplate, the small water container kept there by station staff out of habit, all present. The human, not present. The planet Earth had been a Covenant observer for 22 years. In that time, their delegation had attended most sessions, voted on minor matters, and generally kept quiet. They were not a powerful voice in the chamber. They were new. They were small by galactic standards. They had only one star system. Velthara stared at the empty seat and felt something she did not have a good word for. It was not quite fear. It was more like the feeling of standing near the edge of something and not being able to see the bottom. Then the doors opened. The main doors of the Grand Conclave Chamber were built to impress. They were 12 meters tall, made from a dark alloy that reflected light in deep blue tones, and they opened slowly and with great ceremony. No one was supposed to enter the chamber after a formal address had begun. It was a rule, a very old rule. The doors did not care about the rule. Neither, apparently, did the man who walked through them. He was not tall. He was not large. He wore no ceremonial clothing, no diplomatic silks, no rank sash of any color. He wore a military jacket, dark green, slightly worn at the cuffs, with a row of small campaign ribbons on the left chest that most people in the room could not read but a few could, and those few went very still when they did. His hair was short and gray at the sides. His face was calm in a way that was different from Vokrath's calm. Vokrath was calm because he felt no threat. This man was calm the way deep water is calm, flat on top, and completely unknowable underneath. His name was Jonas Dreth. His official title was Captain Ambassador, a rank that did not exist in normal Covenant diplomatic structure because humans had invented it 3 years ago and had not explained why. He walked to the human delegation's podium without hurrying. He did not look at Vokrath. He did not look at the crowd. He set a small data chip on the podium's reader surface with a soft click, looked up once at the room, and then looked directly at the Dreth high speaker. "We received your message," he said. His voice was quiet. The translators carried it perfectly to every part of the room. "Here is ours." He pressed the chip. The chamber's main display screen, large enough to be seen from every seat, lit up. What played was not a speech. It was not a counter-declaration or a formal protest. It was footage. Compiled footage, clearly organized, clearly labeled in several languages. It showed star maps, fleet movement patterns, supply route diagrams, battle simulations rendered in sharp detail, showing engagements that had not happened yet, projections, wargame results, probability chains, timestamps, coordinates, resource counts. It was, in total, a complete strategic breakdown of the Dreth Dominion's military. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their supply lines, their communication delays, their historical tactical patterns, and the exact points at which each of those patterns had failed, could fail, or would fail under specific conditions. It ran for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it finished, the screen went dark. The room did not make a sound. Velthara realized she had not moved in over 4 minutes. She made herself breathe. She looked at Vokrath. The high speaker was standing in exactly the same position as before, but something had changed in his face. It was a small change, a tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in the set of his jaw. She had seen Vokrath before in other sessions, in recorded addresses. She had never seen that expression on him. She looked back at the human. Jonas Dreth was still standing at the podium. He had not moved. He was still looking at Vokrath. He was not smiling. He was not angry. He was simply looking, the way a person looks at something they have already figured out. After a moment, he reached out, picked up his data chip from the reader, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he sat down. In his seat, in the human delegation section, the one that had been empty 5 minutes ago, he sat down, folded his hands on the desk in front of him, and waited. The chamber stayed silent. Somewhere in the upper tier, a junior delegate from a small world called Prethos dropped his translation device. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed through the whole room. Nobody looked at it. They were all looking at either Vokrath, who had not yet spoken, or at the human, who seemed to have nothing more to say and was apparently perfectly comfortable with that. Velthara turned to her aide, a young Usan named Sella, who was sitting rigidly beside her with all 6 of her limbs held very close to her body. "Pull everything we have on Earth," Velthara said quietly. "Everything, tonight." Sella nodded once fast and started typing. The station did not sleep. It was built for species from 47 different star systems, and many of those species did not sleep at all, or slept in short cycles spread across their day, or slept with half their brain at a time. So the corridors were always lit, the food stations were always open, and the data networks were always running. But there was a difference between a normal night on the station and the night that followed the Dreth announcement. On a normal night, the activity was routine. On this night, every government office on the station had lights burning, every secure communication channel was busy, and the Covenant's main intelligence archive was receiving more access requests than it had seen in 11 years. Everyone wanted to know about humans. It was embarrassing, in a way, how little most of them had bothered to find out before. Earth had been observed and cataloged by Covenant scouts for over 2 centuries. The initial reports were not alarming. The planet was biologically rich, with a dominant species, humans, that had developed technology at a pace that was fast but not unusual. They had wars. Many developing worlds had wars. They had internal divisions, political conflicts, resource struggles. Again, not unusual. The scout reports were filed, cross-referenced, and placed in the lower priority section of the archive alongside 200 other developing worlds. Then a more detailed survey team had gone in 60 years later and found something odd. The humans had, in the time since the first survey, developed nuclear weapons. This was not entirely unexpected. Many species discovered nuclear technology at roughly the same point in their development. What was unexpected was what came next. Most species, upon developing weapons capable of destroying their own world, either used them in a final catastrophic war, or were so frightened by them that they built tight international control systems almost immediately. Humans had done neither. They had built enormous stockpiles of these weapons. They had pointed them at each other for decades. They had come extremely close to using them, multiple times on at least 6 documented occasions. And then slowly, without any single dramatic moment of change, they had pulled back. Not because they were forced to, not because an outside power intervened, just because enough of them decided that it was not the right outcome. The xenosociologists who read that report argued about it for years. No one could fully explain it. The closest anyone came was a Usan researcher named Dreth, who wrote a paper suggesting that humans had a psychological trait that was extraordinarily rare in sapient species: the ability to hold extreme aggression and extreme self-restraint in the same mind, at the same time, and choose between them based on context in ways that were not fully predictable by outside observers. The paper was considered interesting, and then mostly forgotten. It was being read again tonight, in several offices at once. Velthara sat at the desk in her private quarters with a cup of warm Usan broth she had not drunk, and a screen full of files she was reading with all of her eyes at once, which was the Usan equivalent of reading very fast. Celis sat across from her, pulling new files as Velthara finished each one, organizing them, flagging the ones that seemed most important. The file Velthara was reading right now was flagged at the highest level. 200 years ago, shortly after the Dreth had begun expanding in their current direction, a standard Dreth long-range probe had been sent into the Sol system. Standard practice. The Dreth cataloged everything in their future path decades in advance. The probe had been small, quiet, and designed to be invisible to the kind of technology Earth had at the time. It had entered the outer system, done a sweep, and transmitted its data back to Dreth space. The probe had never returned because something had caught it. The Dreth had noted the loss and assumed a navigation failure. It happened occasionally with long-range probes. They had sent a second one 10 years later. Same result. They had sent a third, this one with a self-destruct trigger designed to fire if the probe detected that it was being handled. The self-destruct had not fired. The probe had simply disappeared. The Dreth had reclassified Earth as a low-tech world, with some kind of unusual spatial debris field, and moved on. What Velthara was reading now was a Covenant intelligence report from 40 years ago, compiled by a researcher who had managed to get access to a human military archive through a very complicated series of diplomatic favors. The report said, in plain language, that all 3 Dreth probes had been caught, studied, and disassembled. The propulsion technology from the first probe had been reverse-engineered within 8 years and was now the foundation of Earth's deep space drive system. The communication array from the second probe had been studied and used to build a quantum relay network that Earth officially described as a civilian infrastructure project. The third probe's guidance system had been taken apart component by component and cataloged in a military research facility under a classification level so high that the Covenant researcher who found it was not able to read the actual contents. Only the cover file, which said, in human writing in plain letters. For later. Velthera set down her broth cup. "Sella," she said. "Yes, Ambassador." "The data chip, the one the human left on the podium, did we get a copy of it?" "We did." Station archivists pulled a secondary record from the display system automatically. Standard procedure. "Open it." Sella opened it. It was one file. One single document organized into sections, each one labeled with the name of a Dreth military campaign. There were 14 sections, one for each of the 14 worlds the Dreth had taken. Each section contained the same structure. A full breakdown of how the Dreth had conducted the campaign, what strategies they had used, where their supply lines had run, how long their communication delays were, what tactical errors they had made even in their victories, and what an opposing force would have needed to do to change the outcome. At the end of each section were numbers, simulation results, run to 10,000 iterations minimum, some run to 40,000, showing what various defensive and offensive strategies would have produced under those conditions. This document had not been written recently. The earliest dated entries were from over 60 years ago. Humans had been compiling this analysis for 60 years. They had been updating it, refining it, running new simulations on it every time the Dreth made another move, every time new data became available, every time they got their hands on another piece of technology they were not supposed to have. For 60 years, while the rest of the galaxy had watched the Dreth expand and said nothing, Earth had been studying them. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, with patience, with focus, with the particular kind of quiet, long-term preparation that Dolith's old paper had tried and failed to fully explain. Velthara looked at the last page of the document. It was a summary, one paragraph. She read it 3 times. It said that the Dreth's single greatest vulnerability was not their fleet strength or their supply lines or their tactical patterns. It was their certainty. They had won 14 times without serious resistance. They did not know how to fight someone who was ready for them. They had never had to. At the bottom of that paragraph there was a note. It was dated 11 years ago and it was addressed to no one in particular, written in the way people sometimes write when they are recording a thought for themselves. It said, "Waiting for the right moment. They'll announce first. They always do." Velthara sat very still for a long time. Then she said quietly, "They knew. They knew the Dreth would announce it publicly. They knew this moment was coming, and they used it." She paused. "They used our chamber. They used the Dreth's own tradition of public declaration to put that footage in front of every civilization in the known galaxy at once." Sella was very quiet. Then she said, "Ambassador, should we be frightened of the Dreth right now or of the humans?" Velthara picked up her broth, found it had gone cold and set it down again. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question." The emergency session was called for the following morning. Station clocks ran on a universal standard cycle, and by the time the chamber lights came up to full brightness and the delegates began filling their seats again, most of them had not rested. They looked it. Eyes were tired. Postures were stiff. Small conversations happened in tight clusters before people took their seats, the kind of conversations where voices stay low and bodies lean in close. The Dreth delegation was not present. Vokrath had returned to their docked warship the previous evening and had not communicated with the station since. His empty seat sat at the far end of the chamber like a cold space in the room, noticed by everyone and mentioned by no one. Jonas Reth was present. He was seated in the human section before most other delegates arrived, with a plain metal cup of something warm in front of him and a small personal screen he was reading without any visible concern. He looked like someone waiting for a transport connection. He looked like someone who had already decided how the day was going to go. The session chair, a large gray-skinned Murath official named Presiding Delegate Sarath, called the room to order and stated the matter plainly. The Covenant needed to determine its official position on the Dreth's declared intention to invade Earth. The options were three. The Covenant could formally intervene, meaning it would send a combined fleet to defend Earth. It could formally condemn the invasion, meaning it would say, publicly, that the invasion was wrong without taking any military action. Or it could take no official position and leave the matter between the Dreth Dominion and the planet Earth. Sareth listed the options in that order because that was protocol. Everyone in the room already knew which option was going to win. The Kreth Collective spoke first. Their three-bodied delegate rose from the shared seat they used and delivered a carefully constructed speech about the importance of Covenant neutrality, the dangers of escalation, and the long history of non-interference that had kept the peace between major powers. It was a good speech. It was also, clearly, a speech that had been prepared in advance of this session, possibly in advance of the Dreth announcement itself. The Kreth had seen this coming and had their position ready. The Murath Empire's representative spoke next. He was shorter than most in the room, but wore the kind of formal uniform that was designed to make its wearer look larger. He spoke about the complexity of the situation, the need for careful deliberation, and the importance of not making hasty decisions based on one dramatic presentation. He did not look at Jonah's Reth while he said this. He was clearly trying very hard not to look at Jonah's Reth. Three smaller nations spoke in favor of formal condemnation. Their delegates were younger, and two of them looked genuinely distressed. One of them, a female delegate from a world called Tyrth, said plainly that 61 civilizations sitting silent while one planet was invaded was not neutrality, it was cowardice, and she was not willing to vote for cowardice. The chamber received this in silence. No one argued with her. No one agreed with her out loud either. Velthara spoke forth. She stood at the Usan podium and looked out at the room for a moment before she spoke, the way she sometimes did when she was choosing her words carefully. She said that she had spent the night reading everything the Covenant had on Earth, and she was going to say something that people in the room might not want to hear. She said that humanity was not the defenseless developing world this chamber had been treating it as. She said that the data she had reviewed suggested Earth had been preparing for exactly this situation for longer than most of the civilizations in this room had been members of the Covenant. She said that if the Covenant chose not to intervene, it should not do so under the comfortable belief that Earth was simply going to be destroyed. She said the Covenant should make its choice with full awareness that it was choosing to stand aside from a conflict that might end very differently than anyone expected. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Sareth called for the vote. Formal military intervention, 4 votes in favor, 16 abstentions, 41 against. Formal condemnation only, 31 votes in favor, the rest abstaining. No official position, 9 votes in favor. The final result, therefore, was formal condemnation. A statement would be issued, words would be said, nothing would be done. Sareth announced the result and looked toward the human delegation, as protocol required. It was custom, in the case of a matter directly concerning a member world, to allow that world's delegation a brief response after a vote. Everyone in the room looked at Jonah's Reth. Reth had been still throughout the entire session. He had not used his screen. He had not conferred with anyone. He had sat with his hands folded on the desk and listened to 4 hours of debate about the fate of his planet with the expression of a man watching weather move across a landscape he already knew very well. Now he looked up. He looked at Sareth. He looked at the result display on the main screen, and then slowly the corner of his mouth moved. He smiled just barely, just enough to see. It did not reach his eyes. "Good," he said. The translator carried it flat and clear to every corner of the room. Sareth blinked. "Captain Ambassador, the Covenant wishes to express that this result does not reflect indifference to." "I understand the result," Reth said, not rudely, just firmly. "I said good, I meant it." The room did not know what to do with this. Delegates looked at each other. The Murath representative's carefully composed expression slipped for just a second. Velthara leaned forward. "Jonas," she said, using his name rather than his title, which was not protocol but felt necessary. "Do you understand what the Dreth did to Vel Sora IV?" Reth turned to look at her. His expression did not change. "We've read the reports," he said, "thoroughly, multiple times." He paused. "We've also run the numbers. The Dreth have never fought anyone who wanted them to attack." The room tried to absorb this. Velthara stared at him. "You wanted them to attack." He did not confirm or deny it. He simply held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood up. He buttoned the top button of his jacket, a small, unhurried gesture, and picked up his cup and his screen. He looked around the chamber once, not with anger, not with contempt, just with a calm, comprehensive look that seemed to take in every face in the room and file it away somewhere. "Thank you for your time," he said to Soreth. Then he walked out. Within 40 minutes, every human on the station was gone. They left quietly, without announcement, without checking out at the diplomatic offices as protocol required. Their quarters were clean, their temporary data accounts were closed, and the small water container at the human delegation's desk had been washed and left upside down on a paper towel, which was a level of tidiness that somehow made the whole thing more unsettling rather than less. The chamber staff found a single folded note under the water container. It was addressed to Velthara by name. She opened it in her office with Sela watching. It said, "Don't worry. Stay out of the corridor between Mars and the asteroid belt for the next 90 cycles. Jr." Velthara read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk and stared at the wall. Sela said very quietly, "Ambassador, did humanity just use this chamber as a stage?" Velthara thought about the footage from the night before. She thought about Reth's face when the vote came in. She thought about the note. "They needed the Dreth to commit their full fleet," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "They needed a reason the Dreth would believe, a public announcement, a formal declaration, something that would make the Dreth too proud to back down. And they needed every civilization watching." She picked up the note again. "They've been ready for a long time. They just needed the right moment, and the right room." She looked at the empty doorway, where Jonas Reth had walked out an hour ago. "And we gave it to them," she said, "every single one of us." The Dreth fleet was the largest assembled force in the known galaxy. That was not pride speaking. That was simply a number. 1,400 warships, gathered over the course of 60 cycles in a staging area 3 light-years from the Sol system. Supply vessels, troop carriers, bombardment platforms built specifically for cracking the surface of inhabited worlds when full conquest was not the goal. When Vokrath stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the fleet spread across the tactical display, it looked like a map of power made physical. It looked like the end of a conversation before the conversation began. He gave the order to jump. 1,400 ships folded space and moved. They came out of faster-than-light travel at the outer edge of the Sol system, exactly where the approach calculations said to arrive, a cold, dark stretch of space well beyond the outer planets, where a fleet could form up, take readings, and plan its advance without being immediately engaged. Standard approach doctrine. It had worked on 14 other worlds. There was no reason to think it would be different here. The first officer called out the standard arrival report. Fleet formation intact, all ships accounted for, no hostile contacts detected. Vokrath said nothing. He was looking at the long-range sensor display. The system was quiet, completely quiet. No communication signals from the planet, no emergency broadcasts, no defensive fleet forming up in the inner system, no response of any kind to the appearance of 1,400 warships on the edge of their star system. Just the slow turning of planets and the dim light of a medium-sized yellow star at the center of it all. "They know we're here," the sensor officer said. She sounded uncertain about whether this was good news or bad. No reaction. Vokrath clasped 2 of his 4 hands behind his back. "Advance," he said. The fleet moved inward, past the cold outer planets, past the gas giants, into the middle system where the asteroid belt sat between the outer and inner planets like a wide, broken ring of rock. The approach calculations had already accounted for the asteroid belt. It was a navigation hazard that required course adjustment, but nothing unusual. Every rocky system had debris fields. The sensor officer made a sound. It was not a word. It was a short, sharp sound that Vokrath recognized as the sound of someone looking at something that did not make sense. "Speak," he said. "The asteroids," she said. Her voice was careful in the way that voices go careful when they are trying to stay calm. "The mapped positions, they don't match. Navigation drift, account for it." "Sir, it's not drift." She turned from her screen to look at him. In 14 years of service on Dreth vessels, she had never turned from her screen to look at a commander without being addressed first. She turned now. "The asteroids have moved, not drifted, moved. The positions are there arranged. There are corridors through the belt that weren't there before, and the outer edges of the belt have been pushed inward on 3 sides. If we continue on current course, we will be in a channel approximately 900 kilometers wide that has rock walls on 4 sides and—" She stopped. She looked at her screen again. "And the rocks are not drifting. They are holding position." Vokrath looked at the tactical display. The asteroid belt covered an enormous area of space. It had always been treated as a hazard to navigate around or through with care. He looked at it now and saw what he should have seen immediately, what he would have seen if he had been expecting it. It was not a field anymore. It was walls. It was a structure. The rocks had been moved, thousands of them, positioned and locked in place over the course of many cycles, turning a navigational hazard into something else entirely. Turning it into a canyon. "Pull back," he said. He said it calmly. He said it the way he said every order, flat, clear, immediate. But in all his years of command, in 14 campaigns, in countless engagements and demonstrations of force, he had never said those 2 words before. They felt strange in his mouth. The fleet began to pull back. It was too late. From the dark sides of every moon in the inner system they came. Not quickly, not with the roaring speed of a dramatic charge. They came with the steady, unhurried movement of things that had been waiting for a very long time and were not in a hurry now. Ships of every shape and size. Warships. Yes, proper military vessels with weapon systems that were more sophisticated than anything the Dreth intelligence files had ever attributed to Earth. But not only warships. Large ore haulers with magnetic railguns bolted to their sides, the barrels long and thick, and pointed outward with the simple, practical look of tools built by engineers rather than weapons designers. Deep space mining platforms, enormous structures that had been stationed in the outer belt for years, apparently mining, actually serving as artillery positions, their drill mechanisms replaced with mass driver arrays that could throw projectiles across hundreds of thousands of kilometers with extraordinary accuracy. Civilian transport vessels in configurations that had been clearly modified, their cargo bays open, releasing swarms of small unmanned drones that spread out like clouds of dark points against the star field, and began targeting sensor arrays on Dreth ships with a focused, methodical precision. There were thousands of them, not just military vessels, everything. Earth had converted everything that could move and carry a weapon, and apparently quite a lot of things that by any normal logic should not have been able to do either. The first engagement lasted approximately 40 minutes. In that time, the lead portion of the Dreth fleet, trying to reverse course through a space that had been deliberately shaped to make revering course difficult, lost 112 ships. Not to a single weapon, not to a dramatic decisive strike, but to 100 different things firing from 100 different positions, with a coordination that was quiet and complete, and gave the impression of a system that had thought about exactly this moment for a very long time. Vokrath tried to reform the fleet into an offensive posture. His commanders were good. They had done this before. They pushed forward, trying to break through and get into open space on the other side. It was the right tactical instinct. In every previous campaign, pushing through a defensive line into open space had worked because no defensive line had ever been deep enough to hold. Earth's defensive line was the entire inner solar system. The asteroids were not just walls. They were weapons. Some of them had been hollowed out and filled with explosives, positioned in the approach channel so that when a ship traveled through, the detonation of a single asteroid released debris at velocity from every direction simultaneously. Some had mass drivers attached, small, single-shot devices, remotely triggered, designed to throw a single very large rock at a very specific angle at a specific moment. Some were simply positioned to create channeling effects, forcing ships into kill zones where the mining platforms and the warships and the drone swarms were waiting in coordinated layers. The battle lasted 11 hours and 4 minutes from first contact to the last exchange of fire. In that time, the Dreth Dominion lost 1,391 ships. The losses were not even across the battle. They were heaviest in the middle period, when the fleet was fully inside the asteroid corridor, and the full scope of what had been done to the solar system became clear to every Dreth commander at once. There was a period of approximately 40 minutes in the middle of the battle when Dreth communications spiked with traffic volume, unlike anything in their recorded history, as every ship tried to coordinate a response to a situation that no Dreth training program had ever simulated because no Dreth strategist had ever imagined it was necessary. The 9 ships that survived did not survive because they were lucky. They survived because they were allowed to. The pursuing human vessels broke off at a specific boundary point, clearly marked in the tactical data by a command that went out across all human ships at the same moment. The 9 Dreth ships were given a clear exit corridor. Their engines were not targeted. Their communications were not jammed. They were let go. On the bridge of the last surviving Dreth warship, which was carrying Vokrath, the High Speaker stood at his tactical display and watched the pursuing ship stop. He watched the clear corridor open in front of him. He understood what it meant. He had done it himself twice to 2 different worlds. You let survivors go when you want the story told. He stood at his display for a long time. The battle was over. The Sol system was quiet again. Somewhere behind him, his bridge crew was not speaking. The damage reports were coming in across every screen, but no one was reading them aloud. The room was filled with the kind of silence that happens when people are trying to process something that does not fit inside the categories they have for understanding the world. Vokrath thought about the data chip. He thought about Jonas Reth's face in the chamber. He thought about the line in that document, waiting for the right moment. They'll announce first. They always do. He reached out and activated the fleet-wide broadcast. "Set course," he said. His voice was steady. It was still the voice of a Dreth High Speaker, but it was steadier than it needed to be in the way that things go too steady when everything else is trying to fall. Full speed, home. Behind him, in the dark of the Sol system, 1,400 silhouettes of debris drifted slowly in the light of a yellow star. And the system was quiet, completely quiet, just the slow turning of planets. And somewhere in all of that quiet, a planet with 7 billion people on it went back to whatever it had been doing before. The 9 ships broadcast their sensor logs before they even made it back to Dreth space. It was not a decision made by Vokrath. It was made by the fleet's automated transmission system, which was designed to send battle data back to the Dominion's home fleet the moment a ship's damage threshold crossed a certain point. The system was built for the possibility that a ship might be destroyed before it could report in person. It transmitted everything, the full sensor record of the entire battle, from the moment the fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system to the moment the 9 ships were released through the exit corridor. 11 hours and 4 minutes of data. Complete, unedited, real. The Dreth had a secure military network, but secure networks in an interstellar civilization are only as secure as the people operating them. Within hours of the transmission reaching Dreth home space, copies of it were moving through back channels, diplomatic relay stations, and private communications networks across the known galaxy. By the end of the first day, it had reached every Covenant member world. By the end of the second day, it had reached worlds that were not members of the Covenant. By the end of the third day, there was no spacefaring civilization within communication range of the Dreth Covenant region of the galaxy that had not seen it. Everyone watched. It was not a short recording. 11 hours is a long time to sit and watch battle footage. Most people did not watch all of it at once. They watched pieces. They watched the opening, when the Dreth fleet came out of FTL into the quiet of the outer Sol system, and the sensors picked up nothing. They watched the middle, when the asteroid corridor revealed itself, and the mining platforms and the ore haulers and the drones came out of the dark side of every moon. They watched the 9 ships leaving through a corridor that had been deliberately cleared for them by an opponent that was still in full control of the battlefield and chose, very specifically, not to finish the fight completely. That last part, the 9 ships being let go, was the part that people kept coming back to. It was the part that military analysts on 20 different worlds pulled apart and discussed and argued about and could not stop thinking about, because it was not mercy. Everyone who looked at it understood that it was not mercy. It was a message. The 9 ships were a message, sent back to every civilization that was watching, saying, "We stopped because we chose to stop, not because we had to." The Covenant Council reconvened on the 8th day after the battle. No one was late. No one sent a junior delegate. For the first time in the recorded history of the Grand Conclave Chamber, every single seat in the room was filled by the head of state or head of government of the civilization it represented. Rulers who had never personally attended a Covenant session were there. Leaders who would normally communicate only through their ambassadors were present in person, some of them having traveled for days to get there. The chamber was fuller than it had ever been, and it was the quietest it had ever been. Sarath, the presiding delegate, opened the session by playing the sensor log footage on the main display screen. This was not required by protocol. Everyone had already seen it. He played it anyway, and no one objected, because everyone seemed to understand instinctively that looking at it together in this room was something that needed to happen. The footage played in full, all 11 hours. The chamber watched. By the time the 9 ships moved through the exit corridor and the display screen went dark, no one had spoken for over 11 hours. The room had been sitting together in silence for the length of a battle that had ended one of the most feared military forces in the known galaxy. When the screen went dark, the silence continued. 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Sarath counted, because counting felt like something to do. 4 minutes and 22 seconds of 61 civilizations sitting in a room together without making a sound. Then the Murath Emperor, Caliph III, who had personally traveled from the Murath home world and was sitting in a seat that had never been designed to hold someone of his size and clearly did not care about that at all, rose to his feet. He was the same emperor whose representative had spoken carefully about complexity and hasty decisions at the last session. He rose to his full height, which was considerable, and in a voice that carried no political carefulness whatsoever, said that he wished to formally request the opening of comprehensive diplomatic relations between the Murath Empire and the planet Earth at the earliest opportunity. He sat down. 3 other heads of state rose immediately after him with similar requests. Sarath was still counting the seconds of silence in his head out of habit and had lost track. He looked around the room. He looked at the main doors of the chamber. He said, to no one in particular, "Is the human delegation, are they?" The doors opened. Jonas Reth walked in. Same jacket, same expression. The campaign ribbons on his chest were visible from across the room, and this time Velthara noticed that several of the leaders who were present in person were looking at those ribbons with focused attention. He walked to the human delegation section, set down a plain metal cup of something warm and sat. He looked around the room once, noting who was there, nodding who had sent someone rather than come themselves. He looked at the main display screen where the footage had just finished. He looked at Sarath. "Ready when you are," he said. Sarath opened his mouth and then closed it and then opened it again. "Captain Ambassador," he said carefully, "on behalf of the full Covenant Council, I want to say the result of our last vote regarding intervention is already in the past," Dreth said, not harshly, simply. Sarath seemed to be trying to find the right words for something that did not have right words. There is a desire on the part of many members to discuss a more formal relationship with Earth, with humanity, in light of, he gestured generally at the dark display screen, recent events. "We're aware," Dreth said. Velthara had been watching him since he came in. She had spent the 8 days since the battle reading and thinking and rereading the note he had left for her and thinking some more. She leaned forward now and said, "Jonas, I have one question before we go any further. I want one honest answer." He looked at her. "Was any of it improvised?" she said. "Even a small part of it? Or was all of it planned completely from the moment the Dreth made their announcement?" The room was very still. Dreth was quiet for a moment. He looked at his cup. He looked at the display screen. He looked at Velthara. "The announcement was the best thing that ever happened to us," he said. His voice was quiet. It was not a proud voice. It was a voice that had thought about something very carefully for a very long time. "We needed a reason the council would accept. If we had acted first without provocation, it would have looked different, but the Dreth announced. In this room, in front of everyone, they gave us a reason and they gave us an audience." He paused. "We needed them to commit their full fleet. A partial engagement wouldn't have sent the right message, and we needed everyone watching when it happened." He looked around the room, at the heads of state, at the rulers who had never attended a session before, at the full chamber. "Earth has been ready for this conversation for a very long time," he said. "We just needed the right room." The silence that followed was different from the silence during the footage. That silence had been shock. This silence was the sound of 61 civilizations doing arithmetic. Because every leader in that room, every analyst behind every leader, every military commander watching on relay screens on their home worlds, was running the same calculation simultaneously. If Earth had done that to the Dreth, who had taken 14 worlds without serious resistance, who had the largest fleet in the region, who had spent 60 years preparing this specific campaign, then what was Earth capable of against a force that had not been studied for 60 years? Against a civilization that had not given Earth time to prepare? Against anyone who came at them without the particular disadvantage of having been watched, catalogued, simulated, and outmaneuvered before the first shot was fired? They did not know. That was the point. They did not know, and now they knew that they did not know, and that was a very different and much more important thing than simply not knowing. Velthara looked at Jonas Dreth for a long moment. Then she looked at the room. 61 civilizations, thousands of years of combined history, sitting very still. She had spent 40 years as an ambassador. She had sat in this chamber through wars and treaties and collapses and rebuildings. She had seen powers rise and decline and rise again. She had thought she understood most things about how the galaxy worked. She picked up her pen, an old Usan habit, writing by hand when thinking, and she wrote 4 words at the top of her notes for the session. She looked at what she had written. "We never saw them." She underlined it once. Then she set down her pen, straightened in her seat, and looked at Jonas Dreth, who was sitting calmly with his hands folded on the table, waiting for the most important diplomatic session in Earth's history to begin. And in every corner of that vast, ancient, many-voiced chamber, not one of the 61 civilizations of the Interstellar Covenant could find it in themselves to move first. And